Good evening. I'm Buzz Sharman. I'm local county commissioner. Good to be here tonight. I've been looking forward to this. I really have been interested in hearing the debate, and I'm sorry for using the word debate, but I've been interested in hearing the two sides in regards to Common Core, like most of you. I was very, very interested in being here tonight. We have some distinguished guests with us, and we're so pleased to have them here. I would like to introduce them. To my left to my immediate left is Dr. Sandra Trotsky. It's not Trotsky, it's Stotsky. Okay. We were talking, and I said, I think your politics are a lot different than Trotsky. So. Stotsky, I'm sorry. Good way to start it here in Fallon, Nevada. All right. All right, thank you. I appreciate that. She's Professor Emeritus of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas and is credited with creating one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K-12 students while serving in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. Sitting next to her is Dr. James Milligram, Professor Emeritus of Math at Stanford University. He was the only person on the 25-member validation committee for the Common Core math standards who had any math degree. He and Dr. Stotsky, who also served on the validation committee, refused to validate the final draft of the Common Core standards. We also had planned tonight two members from the Department of Education. They've chosen not to be here.
I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and if you can't hear me in the back, just wave your hand, because I'm somebody who uses her hands to talk as well, and I don't know if I can always keep this right directly in front of my mouth as I'm trying to say something, and also look at these papers. I'm going to give you, first of all, a sense of the background to Common Core's development, which you probably know, but there are always some people that need to have a little bit of refresher information on this. I will talk about the lack of transparency in what happened with the development of Common Core standards and the lack of credentials with the writers. I will talk very briefly about the flaws in the English language arts standards, which are my area of expertise. Professor Milgram will talk about the math, and I will talk only, for the most part, about the English language arts standards. And then I will suggest what kinds of action steps might be appropriate at this point in the development. We realize that this is about 5 years after Common Core was voted in. It wasn't clear from the chronology last night that we were given by your deputy superintendent exactly when there was a vote to adopt Common Core standards. There were votes to adopt drafts of the standards. There were votes to adopt by different groups drafts of the standards. It looks like sometime in June of 2010, there was a formal vote by your State Board of Education. You should know that the final version of the standards wasn't available to the beginning of June. So the question is, in a few weeks, how did the entire state participate in a full review of the standards, the documents, the college readiness, before a board vote in mid-June to fully adopt these standards? That remains to be explained by someone in your Department of Education, because clearly there needed to be a review and an analysis of whether these were actually first-rate standards, not whether they were better than whatever you had before, but were they as good as what you would want for students today looking for the kinds of jobs that might be available in the 21st century. So you have a shifting set of dates to think about, and a question about whether anyone from higher education ever saw those high school math and English language arts standards to let you know whether they would indeed lead to college readiness. That's one of the first issues. Let me begin by first talking about who developed these standards. I'm sure you know that they were developed by private organizations in Washington, D.C., not by the federal government, which had to find private organizations to develop them because the Constitution forbids the federal government from being directly involved in curriculum, instruction, pedagogy, and standards. So the three organizations were the National Governors Association, the Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve Incorporated, which is a spin-off of the NGA. And they were all funded for this particular purpose to develop these standards that they knew would be national standards by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. To this day, we do not know who chose the members of the various committees that were put into place to develop the standards, to write the grade level standards, even the members of the validation committee that we were on. We know how we got on the validation committee, but it was a committee of close to 30 people, and we have no records today, any rationale of why people were chosen for this committee, why Professor Milgram was the only mathematician and I was the only English language arts standards expert on a committee that was to ensure that the standards were internationally benchmarked, comparable to the best out there, research-based, and rigorous. And we were among the 5 people who could not sign off on the standards because we didn't feel that these conditions were met. Could I ask, by the way, for a reminder about 3 minutes before my time is up, just so I know when to wrap up. So we have all of these non-transparent committees in operation, a development that's going to, quotes, transform public education in this country, being carried out to this day without any records of why people were chosen for what they did. And the particularly egregious problem is the standards writers themselves. There were 3 writers for English language arts. Professor Milgram will talk about the 3 writers for the math standards. The writers for the English language arts standards had never taught K-12, had never taught beyond K-12, weren't majors in English, had not ever produced any writings on curriculum and instruction, were unknown in the field. The standards show these problems. After all, if you have inexperienced people who've never written standards before, why should you expect them to do a good job, even if they've got a cast of hundreds, which we were told they had, to help them when they were still making the final decisions without drafts going out regularly? And I have been involved in Massachusetts, so I know what the process is like. There was only one public comment draft in March 2010, and the final version that came out in June that year was very different from the public comment draft. Things were happening behind the scenes that nobody knew anything about, but that was the game that was going on. As I say, we don't know who paid for these people, what their charge was, why they were chosen, what qualifications they were seen to have. To this day, none of that information is available. So we have 2 sets of standards, one in English, one in mathematics, with different kinds of deficiencies in them. Very briefly, let me point out the flaws in the English language arts standards, and you have, I believe, a handout that has a 1-pager that I have created that explains what the major flaws are. We're dealing with skills, not academic content standards. Now, why is that a problem? It is a serious problem because skills-based standards do not give you level of difficulty. You can take, and I'm giving you a different example from the one that's on that page. You can take a standard like find the main idea, find supporting evidence, and you can use it for the 3 Little Pigs, you can use it for Moby Dick. There's nothing in finding the main idea that tells you reading level, difficulty level, cultural content, any of the major things that you would want to be changing and upgrading through the grades if you're going to be preparing students for college or career or good citizenship, as I would put it. So you have a set of standards in English that are not the best standards, let me put it charitably. They may be a little better than whatever you had before. We're not here to talk about whatever you had before because it's the same Department of Ed that gave you whatever you had before. Keep that in mind. It was your own Department of Ed that gave you your previous standards, and we're not going to criticize the previous standards. We're here to criticize Common Cores, which your Board of Education adopted sometime in 2010 for reasons best known to them. And that remains one of the mysteries that all of you as citizens of this state, and I have finally learned how to pronounce Nevada today, all of you should be asking what possessed them to adopt these standards when they had no feedback from higher ed officials who had analyzed these standards in math, literary scholars who looked at the standards in English, to tell them what were their strengths and what were their weaknesses. They did not bother to find out what were the internationally benchmarked standards in other countries that these might be comparable to. How did these meet research standards? I know the research and reading, that's my graduate school education background, and these standards do not meet the test of research evidence. So on what basis did your State Board of Ed adopt these standards in 2010 and to this day not recant? I don't understand. They're intelligent people, they're college-educated people, true across the country. There isn't one Board of Education adopting these standards across the country. I've asked because I've testified in about 25 to 30 states in the past 2 years. Not one State Board of Ed ever bothered to consult its own higher ed institutions to say, is this definition or level of college readiness satisfactory to you? Not one. What does this mean in the long run? It means that somebody in Washington, D.C. is deciding what your admission standards are for your higher ed institutions. Because the link between standards called college ready, which some of you may not have thought about, took me a while to realize they're called college ready standards because the link is very explicit in the Race to the Top application, and you did get Race to the Top money. It says that if students pass the grade 11 test that is seen as the college readiness test, they are entitled to credit-bearing courses in their freshman year at the college level. We don't know where in reading or in math where that college readiness pass score is going to be set. All we know is that if they are deemed to be college ready, they get credit-bearing courses, which means that those credit-bearing courses must match the level of whatever they called college ready on in grade 11. That's going to be the game that gets unfolded in the next few years as those who are considered college ready go on to college. No remediation will be allowed. Oh, yes, that sounds like there's going to be considerable savings, except that you're going to have a number of courses available to meet the students who've been declared college ready in grade 11 if they choose to go to college, and they must be retained if the college wants to keep its Pell Grants and all of the other issues that may be affecting colleges. All of this is a game in the works, and we cannot predict exactly what will happen because the shoe is dropped only every few months or so as we find out what is the next shoe to be dropped on this project. Let me move on to where we need to go, given that there is no mechanism for revising these standards. One of the facts of life you need to be aware of, and this is true for every state that has changed the name of its standards from Common Core to Nevada's academic content standards, Florida's Sunshine academic standards. I mean, the names that have come up in some cases are almost funny. Every state, following Governor Huckabee's advice, has gotten rid of the word Common Core, and they've changed it to mean something else. But it's still the same standards. In fact, in most cases, it's simply cut and paste. They're simply the same standards, they just have different titles. Pennsylvania's academic content standards, whatever it is, they're the same thing because they're all using Common Core based tests for them. But there's no mechanism for changing them. If your teachers find out that there are problems with the standards, doesn't matter, can't be changed. Your Department of Ed can't change them. Your governor can't change them. Your State Board of Ed can't change them. They simply can't be changed unless someone in Washington, D.C. decides that there may be a new group brought together, possibly refunded again by the Gates Foundation, to change the standards in however they want to change them. So we have a problem with being stuck with deficient standards, and what we're not focusing on are the teachers who are going to be teaching to those standards. Unfortunately, the people who are being asked to be accountable, they're not even being asked, I should say, they're being told they will be accountable for student scores on tests based on these standards, are your teachers. And they have not had any role in developing the test items, reviewing the test items, anything to do with understanding the test items on the tests that will be used to hold them accountable. Seems rather unfair to me. And it's not clear why Nevada teachers aren't speaking up, because teachers in many other states, individually or through their unions, are beginning to speak up and to ask why they are being held accountable for tests that they had nothing to do with. This is, who should teachers be accountable for? And I raised this afternoon before a group, and I'd ask you to think about it. In my way of thinking, teachers are hired and fired by local school districts. They still have all the statutory authority that they've had for hundreds of years in this country. Hasn't changed. Whether we're a territory or, as we were in Massachusetts, a colony. Teachers are hired and fired at the local level. They are accountable to whoever hires and fires them. They're not accountable to your State Department of Ed. They're not accountable to the U.S. Department of Ed. They're not accountable to your governor or to your State Board of Ed. They should be accountable to the people who hire and fire and evaluate them on the basis of something they do in that community that has been approved by your local school board. That's the nature of local control. So if your teachers are being evaluated by tests they had nothing to do with, we have a very peculiar situation that I would consider invalid. Let me finish briefly because I think I'm reaching 5 more minutes. Thank you. This suggests to me that we need to look very carefully at your education schools, because that is the last major piece that has been totally untouched by this so-called reform movement. Newer teachers coming into your system have been trained in education schools that in order to be accredited have had to meet certain conditions. We have a new accreditation agency, which probably no one in the media paid any attention to, and probably most local school boards knew nothing about. It came into being a year and a half ago. CAEP is the acronym for this new accreditation agency. Among the criteria for being accredited by this independent outside accreditation agency, among these criteria is one that is very relevant. They must be training their teachers to teach to Common Core's standards. That locks it in. If your teachers are taught only to teach, if they're trained to teach only to an inferior set of standards, K-12, that's all they'll be judged by, that's all they'll be teaching, that's all they can be used in terms of the tests, whatever is in those standards that those teachers will be trained to teach in your schools. It is a circular process that contributes to a degeneration of an academic curriculum. I'm sure you will hear Department of Ed people say, yes, we can add anything we want. Have they? I've heard this in every state I've been in. And so I've asked them, show me the advanced coursework that exists if you have added. Show me the extra standards if you've added any. Nevada, apparently you didn't add any extra 15%, at least that was what we were told last night. But have any individual communities, you have the power to do it, have any individual communities added anything to the Common Core standards? Find out. Ask your local school board. You have every right to ask your local school board. Have you added to Common Core's standards? Because otherwise your students are limited to what I would call the beta worker. If you've ever read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, you would know that there are alpha workers, beta workers, and then there are some other kinds of people in the communities of the future that Aldous Huxley thought about way back in the 20s when he came out with his dystopic novel at that time, which has been read in many an English class. So you have questions that you could ask your own school board. What can you do? Let me say for the last minute and a half a few things, because we'll say more in the course of the evening. I have recommended to parent groups, first of all, that they remove their children, because they have the right to, from any Common Core-based test. You have the right to opt your child out. Every parent in this country has that right. You don't need permission, because you have a right to keep your child at home if your child is sick. If you don't like the field trip school is planning, you can keep your child at home. If you don't want your child to participate in a Common Core-based test, you simply keep your child at home or send your child to school with a note that says, I want my child to receive instruction, teaching, not testing. And you then arrange to have a meeting that your school board sponsors to talk about policies that your school board should be involved in. But that is the less than 95 participation rate that you want to aim for to make a Common Core-based test invalid and unreliable. Also, if you have complaints, go to your local school board. They have the statutory authority over curriculum and instruction, as they've always had. They don't even have to use Common Core's standards. So far as I know, there is no requirement in your state law that says you must use Common Core's standards in your local school district. What you do have to do, probably in your state statute, which I haven't been given a copy of, is that you must administer the Common Core-based test. And many other states, like New York and California, are encouraging parents to take their kids out of a testing day and to get the local school board to vote in a different set of standards. They can administer the test, but they don't have to require the kids to take the test. Very important legal distinction. Secondly, and this is at your state legislative level, and this is where I will end, you have state legislators who want to do something about removing Common Core from your state. First thing is to suspend or delay the tests. You don't want to nail down the coffin, and that is what the tests will do. So you suspend the tests, have a review committee from higher ed, K-12, looking at these two sets of standards, and let that be a part of the bill. Then, at a later time, you try to remove Common Core, and you may use a much better set of standards for the interim, but you develop your own first-class set of standards, not the kind your State Department of Ed gave you a decade ago, and not the kind they gave you in 2010 from Common Core. They have not given you very good standards in the past or at present, so you and certainly after last night, I would say there is reason to think that maybe you could do better without their control of a process for developing first-class standards which your kids deserve. I'm going to stop there, and I'll let Professor Milgram continue here.
Okay, no rest period.
So, let's see. I have to unfortunately read. Yeah, so I'm going to discuss what happened in mathematics. And I'm going to try to give you some background on what the processes were and what the problems were in the writing of the mathematics part of Common Core standards. And then I hope to conclude by expanding on a number of the points that Sandra raised. Well, it's too close. Any rate, and I'll finish at that point, having added to the kind of details that Sandra talked about just now. So I'll start with the discussion in some detail of the members of the mathematics writing team. So there were three lead authors of the Common Core mathematics standards. And these are their names: Mr. Phil Darrow, Dr. Jason Zimba, and Dr. William McCullum. Now the last two both have their PhDs in mathematics and had until recently taught in respectable universities in various areas of the country. The third is much more interesting. And I'll remind you again, his name is Phil Darrow, and I'm going to give you now some of the background on this fellow. So Phil Darrow had, unlike the others, had a considerable amount of experience with writing mathematics standards. The other two had never written in any way, shape, or form any standards for any state that were ever used. So back to Phil Darrow. Here, the first thing where I became aware of his work on standards was that he was the lead writer for the 1992 California standards in mathematics. Now, some of you may know that there was something called the Math Wars. It probably spilled over into Nevada. A lot of what we do in California does. And it was, in fact, the 1992 math standards that precipitated the Math Wars. The problem was, the thing that was dramatic about those standards was that before 1992, California wasn't doing well. When I came to California in the early 1970s or late 1960s, it was basically at the top of the scale among all the states in terms of education outcomes. But by the 1985 to 1990, it had moved to the middle of the pack. Okay, over the next 4 years, from 1992 to 1996, it moved from the middle of the pack to 49th. And the comment that was most commonly heard in California in those days was, "Thank God for Mississippi." So that's the first qualification that Mr. Phil Darrow has. The second qualification that he has is that he's not happy with what he had done in California in 1992. He proceeded to head up the committee in Georgia that was writing their standards somewhat later. It got so bad that the governor fired him and called me in. And I put together a team of professionals that wrote solid standards that were more or less in place, although misused, in Georgia until the Common Core was adopted. and still not happy with what he had done, he proceeded to lead the writing of the New Jersey state standards. And I didn't have to intervene there, because by that time people were aware that this was a risky business. And so they did it all by themselves. They threw them out, and they proceeded to revise those standards and ended up with some pretty reasonable standards. So that's Phil Darrow. Now, the thing you have to understand is that the Common Core standards are very, very similar to the 1992 California standards. There are differences in that at certain points in the core standards, the mathematics is a little less ignorant. But in terms of philosophy, in terms of the analysis of process that goes on, they're virtually identical. So it is no surprise, and should be no surprise, that the words you are hearing today, the stories of the children bursting out into tears when taking the Common Core tests, as happened in New York, the stories that you hear that are satirized, in fact, of students attempting to add the small numbers like 7 and 11, and it takes them half an hour to do this, and they have to do it in 5 different ways that are unrelated to each other. And all of that you have been hearing about Common Core, that's exactly what we were hearing in 1992. In fact, the programs, the curricula that we got rid of in California in 1996-97, they're back. They're being used again throughout the country now. Before, it was just limited to California. Now it's everywhere. And so here we are with connected math, back again, everyday math, everybody's using everyday math, and so on and so forth. And again, it's no surprise then that the same comments I was hearing so many 20-odd years ago are being repeated today. And likewise, it's worth pointing out that those standards went away. The 1992 standards were so bad that the state legislature in California in 1996 wrote enabling legislation to cancel the 1992 standards and write new standards for California. And those standards, I and 3 of my colleagues at Stanford, we participated in that, and we were the basic authors of the old 1997 California standards. Those standards were in place in California for 13 years until the Common Core came along. One thing, though, that is worth noting is that those 13 or 14 years of standards, the same coherent, consistent standards, generally regarded as the best in the country and among the best in the world, we had tests. We started with tests in 1998 aligned to those standards, and we kept those same tests until 2012. So we had 14 years of consistent, coherent data on the students coming from, coming from those tests, and it was consistent because the standards and the curricula in place were unchanged over that period. So I got curious, and I decided to look over to ask the question. Well, there was no doubt that the 1992 California standards were a disaster, but how badly did they harm children? Or did they at all? And so I analyzed things in the following way. I looked at a class that was in kindergarten in 1992-93, and I followed them up until they graduated from high school. I then looked at the class that was in kindergarten in 93, 94, and followed them through high school, 94, 95, and 95, 96, and 96, 97. So we looked at these classes, and I analyzed the data on the test against the class, and basically what I was saying is, if you were in the old standards, the 1992, i.e. Common Core standards, for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, how did you do? And the answers were, actually they were in a sort of way better than I expected. I expected 2 years to be the critical point. But that's not what the data showed. The data showed that students who'd been in it for 3 years recovered slowly, but they did recover. By the time they graduated, they were where everyone else was. But if they were in it for 4 years, they never recovered. And 5 years would have been worse if I'd done the analysis. So what we're talking about there, what is relevant, I mean, what we're talking about there is totally relevant to today, because, as I say, we're dealing with the same things we were dealing with then in California, today with Common Core. So it is reasonable to assume, to make at least a temporary assumption, that the same window of opportunity that was there for the 1992 standards, 3 years or less, is operative today for the Common Core standards. So one would have to worry that any student that is in Common Core for 4 or more years will have been sufficiently damaged that they never recover. And if I had been a member of the Department of Education, if I had said such a thing, that something that educators do that it will actually harm children, I would be lynched. But I'm not. I'm a mathematician, a research mathematician, and I can support these claims with rock solid data, and so you have to live with it. Okay. So that's the authors. Now, I produced some handouts which I guess don't exist. Where I talk about missing or delayed standards in Common Core's mathematics standards.
Sir, I believe they were all given out.
At any rate, in Fallon, they don't exist. Sorry about that. It just happened.
They were handed out, you said?
They were
was
handed
going to
out.
copy them.
Yeah, but we'll certainly
pages, it's
arrange
hard to
for people to
do it right
have them. I will send PDFs of the files.
Yeah, we can email them if you sign in.
So
We'll send them out.
yeah, so if you sign in, the organizers of this meeting will make sure that you get them. In those, I analyzed the types of problems that occurred in the mathematics in Common Core, and it was of various kinds. There were an enormous number of missing standards. Now, certain standards that, we were depending in a real sense, we're depending in a real sense on the expertise of the 2 PhDs in mathematics on the writing team. But it turned out that their knowledge was superficial of the subject. They had produced legitimate PhDs in the subject at good schools, but the kind of expertise you need to be able to write standards is to know where every single topic that occurs in K-12, to understand how it works going up the scale into college, into graduate schools, into the workforce. What are these standards used for in real life? And the 2 authors did not understand this. And so what they did was, well, they said, in a number of cases, they said, well, look, we don't see any use for these certain topics here. Therefore, they're not useful. Therefore, we leave them out. So there are certain missing topics. One of them is something a little arcane called partial fraction decomposition, whatever the heck that is. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to tell you. But what it is not so important as what it does. And what this did, I had no idea about until what I was teaching systematic. I taught for many years at Stanford. I taught a differential equations course. And all of a sudden, in the differential equations course, I was getting juniors and seniors at Stanford, and they shouldn't have been taking it. If they were going to take it at all, they would take it as sophomores. So, and I kept getting specific kinds of questions about specific kinds of systems of differential equations and methods of solving them. And finally, I asked them what it was that was bothering them. And they said that, you know, in our engineering courses, we're doing very poorly. We're having a terrible time because we can't do the following kind of problems, and that's happening all the time in our courses. That's just a basic technique. And I looked at it, and I said, you don't know partial fraction decomposition? What the heck is going on? And I found out. One of the authors, the lead writers of Common Core, had written a book called The Harvard Calculus, which we had adopted to teach the first-year calculus course at Stanford. Well, since the author of the Harvard Calculus didn't understand what partial fraction decomposition was used for, he left it out. And so we got to this problem, and that's the kind of thing I talk about in here. I talk about, when I say missing topics, I have a very good reason, and I try to explain it when I can. I have a very good reason for including the fact that they're missing and that matters. And the errors, well, there are almost always errors in standards, but some of these are extraordinarily serious. Thank you. And so this handout does all of that, and it's 10 pages long, and I'm only scratching the surface. There are a lot of problems with the Common Core math standards. Okay, so now let me. I hope you'll get copies of these things, and to the best. As best you can, at least look at them, because they will give you an idea that there are real issues. And the other end of these issues is that Common Core standards, by the end of 8th grade, are 2 or more years behind international expectations, and they only go through Algebra 2. And it's a weak Algebra 2 and a peculiar geometry. And there they stop. There are no more advanced courses than that. There's no trigonometry. There's no pre-calculus. There's no linear algebra. And that's the definition that they give for college ready. Well, fine. Do you want to know what probabilities are of getting a bachelor's degree at the university, a 4-year degree at a university with that background? Not very good, 1 in 3. Well, of course, that's better than it was with their first draft, which stopped with Algebra 1. If you come out of, and this would, for that draft, would define college ready. If you come out with just an Algebra 1 background out of high school, your chances of getting a college degree are 7%. So you can see how unrealistic the whole thing is. That it's just, it just has no contact with reality. And I think, let's see, I've probably gone on long enough, don't you think?
You can wrap it up in a couple of minutes or two. That's
okay. Yeah. So there's just one other thing I want to say, and I want to switch back to something that Sandy had pointed out. So let me read you some remarks from that Peter Hennessy just sent me, and I'm going to read a paragraph here.
A little closer to the microphone.
Yeah.
The Council of Academic Standards had never formally voted on the final released version of Common Core. They deemed to have voted to approve it because they voted to recommend for review a preliminary version. And someone represented to them that the preliminary and the final versions were identical. Okay, now, if one can verify this claim, then let me tell you what the situation is. There was one public draft in mathematics in October. That was the 2009. That was the Algebra 1 draft. There was one public draft in January, which did the Algebra 2, weak Algebra 2 in geometry. There was one public draft in March, which did the same. It was the same in those three courses, and there was a hint that there might be a path to calculus, but just a hint. Those were the public drafts, but behind that were a whole lot of private drafts. In May there were 3 private drafts. There was a private draft in January, a private draft in February, and the public draft in March. Nothing in April. 3 private drafts in May, and the final draft in early June. The assertion that the final draft is identical with any one of those drafts is nonsense. And if you can verify that this claim was actually made, this allows me to send you whichever version, whichever draft they claim was used, and you can then compare that draft to the final version and see for yourself how dramatically different these versions are. So there is every reason to assume that the adoption of Common Core in Nevada was illegal. And it might be worthwhile to pursue this if there are education lawyers in the audience. Here's a good opportunity for some pro bono work. Okay, with that, I think I'll finish. Thank you very much.